hardly.
Except for her in the background to say,
Don't make me swear.
just did have one at the food court. Yeah.
Great. Okay, testing 1, 2, 3.
So you didn't have this or that.
Hi, Kyra.
No, I do. Yeah,
So as a
There was a balcony, but it was further.
You know that old line? Are you ambivalent? Well, yes or no? So I suggested to her that now would be a really good time for her to take a step back, spend time with Eloise, think about what she wants to do next. So I'd be very glad for us to nominate you as Learning Ministries trustee, which means that's a council position, but also working with Sherry Miller and with the board. Okay?
Sounds good.
Good. Thanks.
Anybody want anything to drink while I'm over there?
Oh, thank you, Sissy.
Oh, yeah.
What's
These
that?
aren't the same pattern.
Oh, you have to remember
She was adorable on Sunday, I have to say.
Oh, and I have to go to,
Yes?
Bad as words, I have one.
Yay! Congratulations. You can breathe.
You want to take some soup home? I wish I got my stuff like this time.
you take notes,
Yeah.
so when you ask a question, like you said, you tell me the answer.
What do you do with the notes afterwards?
I just keep them in my notebook.
Okay?
So thank you all. We're going to get started now. I want to be respectful of our time that we have. We hope to be p.m. And just a word of thanks to all of you for hanging in there. We have this Wednesday and next, which will be our last 2 weeks for this series. And thanks for the helpful comments and appreciations. I also have been really pleased with these videos. So again, we say thanks to our scouts. I think they're going to be rolling the gate down. And we're going to start with our video. Now, as you've seen, we've met a number of people, eyewitnesses to Holy Week. And this evening, we're going to be meeting yet another of the figures who we meet not only in the pages of Scripture, but in the course of the story of Holy Week. So, without further ado, we'll start our video.
Unusual distinction of being a minor Bible character, but when you know more about the most focused in the gospel. All four gospels record events from the last week of Jesus' life. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, while Mark and Luke got their information from other sources. Though each writer had his own information sources and goals, the Holy Spirit inspired the writing of all four books. Matthew tells you that I was very rich, came from Arimathea, was a disciple of Jesus, went to Pilate to get the body of Jesus, wrapped the body of Jesus in a linen cloth, laid Jesus' dead body in my own new tomb, and rolled a giant stone over the tomb's entrance. and placed it in a tomb and rolled a stone over the entrance. Luke adds the information that I was good and upright. I had not consented to the decision and action to crucify Jesus. I came from Judea, and that the tomb was new. John completes my information by saying I was a secret disciple of Jesus because I feared the Jewish leaders, that I was accompanied by Nicodemus when I prepared the body of Jesus, that he and I wrapped the body in spices in accordance with Jewish customs, and that the tomb was in the garden where Jesus had been crucified. John adds that we laid the body in the tomb on the day of preparation. I tell you all of this detail for a very specific reason. I am uniquely qualified to tell you about the last day of Jesus' life. When you hear my story, you will also guess where the writers of the Gospels got some of their detailed information. I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, the child of a wealthy Jewish merchant. When I was young, my family moved from Arimathea to a large house on Mount Zion, only a few hundred yards west of the temple in Jerusalem. We could walk straight east from my house, cross the bridge you know as Wilson's Arch, and enter the temple grounds, our treasured, custom-made robes billowing, without even having to mingle with the poor people, let alone be bothered by beggars. My father was a Sadducee, as were many of the other wealthy Jewish leaders. We were very socially concerned, didn't believe in the resurrection, and not overly concerned with intricate theological arguments. Although we didn't believe in the resurrection, we did believe that the Messiah would restore Israel to its rightful, powerful position among the countries of the world. We looked for a Messiah that would restore King David's earthly power, although that power had not really existed for nearly 1,000 years. Since we were wealthy, I went to school and studied the Torah with other wealthy children. Sometimes, exceptionally bright children, such as Saul of Tarsus, joined our group. But mostly I knew rich people. Rich people came to our house for dinner. My parents' friends were all powerful. Wealth was much more important to us than having perfect theology. We paid poor rabbis to be concerned about theology for us, just as some of you modern people pay your preachers to think about theology for you. Almost a week before the death of Jesus, I learned that he and his disciples were in town. I rushed to hear the famous teacher and found that he was surrounded by people of all kinds. Naturally, I gravitated to stand by my friends, other rich and very richly attired Jews. We looked like gaudy peacocks next to poorly clad Jesus and his ragtag disciples. We rich, religious Jewish leaders loved our robes. The more Jesus taught, the more I believed. The more Jesus taught, the angrier my friends became. They grew louder, and I grew quieter. They asked him loaded questions, and he turned back every verbal challenge. And people loved watching Jesus take on the religious establishment. And I did too. I so badly wanted to hear Jesus, and my robes kept me safe from suspicion. I wasn't paying attention to the storm that was brewing. I started hearing rumors that one of Jesus' followers had taken a bribe to betray him to the Jewish leaders. It sounded so silly. Why would such a powerful man be afraid of a homeless preacher? On Thursday night, I celebrated Passover with my entire family. Like other rich people, we had a choice lamb and used expensive cups and plates. I have to admit that while the service was going on, I didn't notice any difference in it than the many others I had attended in my life. My life was as normal as could be, until about midnight, when nothing in my world would ever be the same. There was a loud, crashing knock on my front door. I jumped out of bed, threw on the nearest robe. My servants and I arrived at the door at the same time. There were many of my friends holding torches that shouted at me to get dressed and to come with them. It was an emergency, and the Sanhedrin was going to meet. It must be quite an emergency, I thought, since the Sanhedrin almost never met at night. We entered the Sanhedrin building. I understood the commotion. They were afraid of Jesus. They wanted to kill him because they were afraid of him. Nothing was going to stop that bloodthirsty mob, but they had no authority to kill him. That's the knowledge I console myself with anyway. They only had legal authority to beat him before letting him go. I settled in for a long trial, and that is what I got. Witness after witness, their testimonies conflicted or were patently false, but they kept calling them. Out of frustration, the leaders called to take Jesus to Pilate and ask for a sentence of death. It was daybreak. Almost everybody in the room voted yes, but not me. I was too cowardly to object, but I did not vote for it. I was sure that Pilate would see his innocence and let Jesus go. I knew Pilate from some of my business dealings, and I knew him to be a smart, honest man. He was so stubborn that he would never give in to the demands of the Jewish leaders. The sun rose. We took Jesus before Pilate, and our leaders asked to have Pilate crucify him. He had the authority to kill Jesus, whereas they did not. Pilate was known to crucify people for a lot less reason than appeasing the Jews, but he still was an honorable man. Jesus was tried before Pilate, and I heard the precious words from Pilate. I find no guilt in this man. That should have been the end of it. Pilate should have given him a light beating and let Jesus go. But he could not withstand the threats and pressure from the Jewish leaders. So he sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, for further examination, hoping the whole mess would go away. Herod Antipas tried to question Jesus, but Jesus just ignored his questions. Rather than be humiliated in front of everyone, Herod Antipas quickly sent him back to Pilate. Pilate repeatedly tried to release Jesus, but the leader's threats kept coming and coming. He had Jesus savagely beaten, hoping to satisfy the Jewish leaders, but that just inflamed them more. If Pilate would not kill Jesus, it would cause a riot among the people, and Pilate might lose his job. He gave in. Finally, Pilate gave in. He gave the order. Crucify Jesus. I could not believe it. The hate from the Jewish leaders was enough to kill an innocent man. I had done nothing to stop the travesty, and it was too late now to do anything. The fate of Jesus was sealed. He was going to be crucified, and most assuredly would die a gruesome, grisly death. I was humiliated and scared for me and for my people. We weren't sending a guilty man to his death, and there were few things that made God angrier than the shedding of the blood of an innocent man, especially if that innocent man turned out to be the very Son of God. Like the prophets before me, I prayed for my people and for myself. Some of the Jewish leaders followed Jesus to Golgotha, where he would be murdered, but most of us went to our homes. Shamefully. There was every reason for God to end our lives that day. As the hours passed and the sky darkened and an earthquake happened, I believed we were all going to die. And we deserved to. A messenger came to my house and told me that the massive curtain, 60 feet high, thick, massive curtain in the temple had been torn in half, from top to bottom. I knew his temple and would never return. I could not stand it any longer. I rushed out of my house, followed by a few of my most dedicated servants. In less than 15 minutes, I reached a horrific scene. 3 men hanging on crosses. As usual, they were placed next to a major road where people could see them, eye to eye, cheer at them, and be reminded of the absolute power of Rome. But he was the one in the middle. Above his head was Pilate's sarcastic sign. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." There was a small crowd of women nearby, staring at Jesus. But unlike typical Jewish women, they were praying instead of wailing. I rushed up, just as a Roman soldier jabbed his spear into Jesus' side. Involuntarily, from somewhere deep within me, I don't know where, a scream emerged. I kept it in. I couldn't let something like that happen with who I was, who I represented. No. Then, I watched in morbid fascination as blood and water shot from the hole inside his side. He didn't feel the spear. Jesus was already dead. With his death, with my fear of who I was and what I was becoming, and the difference between them died too. Just vanished. I nodded to an officer who stood nearby and instructed him to follow me to Pilate. He was afraid to abandon his post, but he was more afraid of a wild-eyed rich Jew with unknown intentions headed to see his boss. On the way, I realized that both Pilate and the Jewish leaders had a big problem. What would they do with the body of Jesus? Romans typically left the bodies of the crucified to rot on the cross as a deterrent to future criminals. But Pilate would be ashamed to have that body stay in the public eye since he knew Jesus was innocent. The Jewish leaders were obligated to have the body buried within 24 hours after death. They wanted to disassociate themselves from Jesus' death and just have the whole matter go away quietly. When my small entourage reached Pilate's garden, I just walked in. I guess Pilate's bodyguards thought the officer with me was under orders to report. Plus, they were familiar with me from my past dealings with Pilate. When I entered the room, Pilate just gave me a questioning look. I said, "Please, give me the body of the innocent man." The officer confirmed that Jesus was dead, and Pilate gave his body to me. I was sure Pilate was appreciative that I was removing a sign of his shameful action. Back we went to Golgotha, where the officer instructed his soldiers to remove the dead Jesus from the cross. Sickened by the thought of them ripping his hands and feet from the nails, my servants and I removed him from the cross. I then sent one servant to fetch linen cloth, and other servants to buy burial spices and perfumes. They only had an hour to buy those things because sundown was approaching, and the burial had to happen soon. My servants gone, I was in a quandary. What would I do next? There was a muffled cough behind me. I turned around. Nicodemus. It was my friend Nicodemus, another secret follower of Jesus. I said, "My tomb is over there. We will carry him." The blood drops of Jesus stained our robes. Our expensive, pompous robes that now we would never wash. We reached the opening of the tomb. My servants began to arrive. Nicodemus and I personally prepared the body with the spices and then carefully wrapped it with linen strips. We placed the headpiece over his face and head and laid him down. With one last look, we left the tomb. It took 6 of us to lever the stone in place over the tomb face. where we sealed it. It would take a dozen strong men to remove that stone because I had designed it that way. Nicodemus and I were ritually unclean because we had touched a dead body. We would not be able to celebrate Passover. But neither of us really cared. Jesus was dead, and our hopes and dreams were shattered. We were no longer secret followers of Jesus, and would likely lose our seats in the Sanhedrin and our places in high society, and lose much of our wealth. Standing there in our blood-stained robes, they seemed like treasures that no longer had any value.
So what did you think? Any questions or thoughts kind of rise to the surface as you watch this? First of all, they do a pretty good job on Joseph of Arimathea with a cameo of Nicodemus. So what did you see? What struck you? Eric. Right. But there are a few things that I think buttress this monologue. Nobody just goes to see Pontius Pilate. This is the Roman emperor's legate, his stand-in in the territory of Judea. And so, I mean, just imagine, I think I'll go talk to the governor today. You know, it just doesn't happen. I really appreciated the possibility that Joseph of Arimathea had done business with Pilate. But for whatever reason, including the fact that members of the Sanhedrin may have been part of the same upscale, wealthy, elite group of people there living in Jerusalem. Another thing that we know about Pilate was that he really didn't live in Jerusalem all the time. He lived in Caesarea Maritima, which was the great port city that was north and just west of Galilee, and had come down to Jerusalem for Passover, probably out of a sense of caution and out of a sense that there could be trouble. And it would be a good time for the legion to be there and for Pilate to be there as well. Other thoughts? Nicolette!
I was thinking the change of Joseph, because he was a high and mighty, look at me, I got my fancy robes on, I'm all pretty musical, to go down to where it meant nothing. So he just changed during that time.
Yeah, you know, for any of us who are old enough to remember the robe and all that came around that amazing novel and that film, I thought this was a really interesting and symbolic metaphor. The pompous robes of the Sanhedrin and the blood-stained robes as they carried the corpse of Jesus to its resting place in Joseph's tomb. Yeah, it was a powerful image. So much of it. What did you think about, by the way, that Joseph is one of the few characters that appears in all four of the Gospels? And yes, an important person who is remembered. Now, let's remember the four Gospels obviously reflect a tradition of the early church in its first decades, but all the way extended into maybe 100 AD, maybe even a little past that in terms of John's Gospel. So Joseph of Arimathea holds that affirmation of his goodness, of his intervening, of finally coming to faith and acting on behalf of Jesus in a way that none of the disciples could have. There wasn't anyone around Jesus that could have requested or demanded his course, unless that person were a member of their Senate, part of the Sanhedrin. Yeah. And so he takes a step that absolutely puts all of his power, all of his elite status, not only at risk, it puts an end to it. No longer a secret one, out of fear. Other thoughts? Yes, Linda.
I have two questions. Joseph said that Pilate was an honorable man. So was he someone very well respected? I didn't get the sense of that in the Bible. And then the second question is, do we know what happened to Joseph?
Okay, so Pontius Pilate, an honorable man. A number of scholars look at the four Gospels, and the Pontius Pilate who you meet in Mark's Gospel, arguably the earliest of the four, it doesn't seem terribly honorable. He just has a problem he wants to go away. And he doesn't want to risk a riot because his post is at risk. So it's all very self-centered. It's very much about his future. But as you look at the four Gospels, you begin to get a sense of Pontius Pilate as sort of pleading for the release of Jesus and really and ultimately wringing his hands and washing his hands of it. Matthew tells the story of his wife saying, have nothing to do with that innocent man because I was kept awake with a vision of him. And of course, therefore, we all know what happens when we don't listen to our wife. Thank you, Sharon. She may be watching this later on live. By the time we get to John's Gospel, it really does seem as if the religious leaders, the temple authorities, are really the evildoers in the story, and that Pilate is trapped. Because, and if you look in John's Gospel, you will see there where they say, we have no king but Caesar, which is a thing hard to imagine. But by the time John writes, maybe as late as 100, it may have been that already the separation between Pharisaic Judaism and the Jesus community may have been more defined. So that Judaism may not have been a factor as it might have been in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, or even 80 or 90. But by the time John writes, it may be that Rome was already looking past Judaism and instead looking at the Jesus cult as its own thing, not just a variant of Judaism. Now, do we know what happened to Joseph of Arimathea? It depends on who you ask. There are traditions in France, that Joseph of Arimathea brought Mary Magdalene to France. It's pretty much a medieval construction, but, you know, how did those relics get all over Europe? I'll leave it to you to decide whether Joseph of Arimathea went to France with Mary Magdalene, but that is one of the traditions, and there are many.
There's the other one is that he went to England. So
Yes.
There's a strong sense that Joseph of Arimathea went to England.
Yeah. Yeah, and how much of that is sort of European Christianity sort of, creating links between the biblical period and their own period, and the sort of the authentic faith being buttressed by these figures traveling and making the move. Yeah. Yes, Nicolette.
Would Joseph, he was so afraid of the Sanhedrin and all them, and they wanted to kill Jesus. Would he maybe have been in trouble then with them for going to get the body? Because they would have known that.
Yes. And it's not just supposition on our part. Matthew's gospel makes a very strong case that the religious temple leadership was involved in a plot to create a sort of an alternative reality that the disciples were grave robbers, and paid off the guards who had guarded Joseph's tomb, and were bribed to say that the body was, taken away. So that's a piece. Only in Matthew's gospel out of the four. But, and we don't exactly know when Matthew's gospel was written. Let's assume maybe 75 to 80. Matthew says, and the story is still told to this day. Sort of feels like a mystery novel, doesn't it? The idea that there was this scurrilous cheating and lying and creating a false narrative on the part of these political / religious leaders to take down the apostolic community that was gathering around the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. Yes, Ian, please.
One thing that bothered me about the text is that he kept saying Jewish leaders.
Oh, yes.
He was a Jew. He would never have referred to the leaders as
Right.
Jewish leaders.
That's right.
He would have referred to them as my leaders or
Right.
our people, kind of
Right.
kind of
Or even
thing.
the
So-
leaders.
So, and
Yes.
it's repeated.
Oh, yeah, over and over and over again.
Talked about it, so that upset. But the other thing that I appreciated was at the end he said, so I couldn't celebrate the Passover because I was unclean. And that's a part that often gets forgotten, that the synoptics have Jesus eating the Passover on the day before he was crucified, whereas John says that he is crucified on the day that they are preparing the Passover. And in John, the meal is not a Passover; it's a meal.
Right.
But he doesn't institute the Lord's Supper. So I thought that part was an interesting thing that we don't often.
Right. And there are so many arguments. Oh my goodness! If you Google
Yeah.
that, you would see the difference between the Johannine timeline of the story and Mark, for example, who describes what I think is the sort of common view of the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, Luke, which is that Jesus is buried just before the beginning of this very holy Shabbat, this very holy weekend, where they go from Friday night to Saturday night. The women are not going to go to the tomb in the dark, I promise you. Nobody is going to be out on the streets of Jerusalem in the dark. But the moment that they can at least see the nose in front of their face, they get there on Sunday morning. I think the way the synoptics tell the story really holds water. It shows a depth of understanding of the way that Sabbath keeping works. But you're right, they touch a dead body. They are ritually unclean, as well as being now outcasts of the Sanhedrin. They've just been kicked out of every country club to which they'd ever belonged. Let's say a word about Jewish leaders. Our lectionary still calls for the gospel, the Passion Gospel, according to John on Good Friday. John's gospel comes, I believe, from a later period. And John does not distinguish between Jesus' advocates partners, companions, and adversaries and enemies. Everything goes under this one word, Judeoi, Judeans, or the way it's most often translated in English, Jews. And it's so easy to slip into this kind of generalizing about any race of people. After World War II, tremendous effort on the part of Christian communities to, in light of the Shoah, in light of the Holocaust, to recognize sort of the sources of so much anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism was the way people read their Bibles. Moses with the horns, which was a mistranslation of the Hebrew, but not so much that Michelangelo didn't build them in. So how careful we need to be in our own day and age, where we know that, that hateful acts towards synagogues and toward our Jewish neighbors are being visited upon them, and some of that is bad theology that is coming from the pulpits and from the study groups of Christian churches. That's why some number of years ago, I personally felt that I could no longer use John's Passion account on Good Friday, and began instead to use whatever was the gospel for that year. So this year, the Gospel of Matthew, which is more respectful of the differences between people and does not just sort of paint with this very thick brush that anyone who is an enemy of Jesus, the Jews, when everybody around Jesus is Jewish, including Jesus. There's really only one big figure in the whole business that is not. That's Pontius Pilate, which they should have called him the Gentile. You see? But how we, out of love for our neighbor and out of a sense of care for those who could so easily be lined up, and all we have to do is look at the history, Christ killers, those who they did away with our Lord. They, as if they all had a meeting. We can be a part of addressing that and recognizing where the fault lies. The religious leaders, the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who had the levers of power. I mean, at least that's the way it was in the ancient world. And instead, recognizing that people who were both supporters and companions of Jesus and adversaries both claimed to be descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know all people by our deeds, by what we do, how we act, where we set ourselves up. And there's a rich vein of interpretation that I think we Christians owe to our neighbors, so that we don't even innocently perpetuate some of these generalizations that have caused tremendous pain, bloodshed, and even genocide. Yes, Nicolette.
Is there anything in history that says the Sadducees changed their mind about Jesus, who he was?
Not that I know of. Sadducees were an interesting bunch. They were the well-educated. Watch out for them. Watch out for the well-educated. They were raised on Greco-Roman, Hellenistic culture, philosophy. They were the intelligentsia. Yes, they tended to look only to Torah. The reason it says they didn't believe in the resurrection was in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. I challenge you to find a scripture about the afterlife. It's not there. Same reason the Samaritans would have only cleaved to the Torah, not to the prophets, to the Nevi'im, and not to the writings, to the Ketuvim. But as can be the case with elites generally, who look their nose down at people who aren't as sophisticated or as academic as they are. Remember how they challenged Jesus? The woman, how many husbands did she have? 7. Which one will be her husband in the afterlife? And Jesus just looked at them and said, you idiots. I don't know if he said shut up in there, but I'm pretty sure he might have. So, and other thoughts? Yes, Colleen.
In this depiction, Joseph says that he sent servants to buy spices and linen and to wrap the body. But then we have in the Bible that the women came on Sunday with spices and linen. And it does say that the body was already wrapped in linen. So is there like multiple layers of spices and linen? Is that
I think what there are multiple layers of tradition, where the sense you get from the earlier Gospels is that the preparation of Jesus' corpse for a proper burial could not be completed in time for sundown. And I say this as someone who grew up in New York City, where there was a radio station, the most popular radio station, WINS, the news, where at, let's say today at 6:40, you would hear, attention, the Jewish Sabbath will begin at 5:40 this evening. It was sponsored by one of the big funeral homes in Manhattan. But this was so important, and I tell you, I used to drive home on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. You took your life in your hands at 5:40 because of all of the poor guys who worked in the warehouse who had to get home and out of their car before Sabbath happened. Otherwise, everybody in the neighborhood, looking at you violating the Sabbath by not getting home in time. So, Colleen, I think really what's happening is multiple traditions. The John tradition, from what I see, Joseph and Nicodemus figure more in a more apparent way. But if you look at the earlier Gospels, Mark and then Matthew and then Luke, I think what's clear is that the women go as early as they can, as soon as there's any daylight on Sunday, to complete the task. The devotional task, if nothing else, beside spices and wrappings, but what is owed to a dear one. And there's just no time on Friday to get that done, which is why they're asking each other, who will roll away that stone? They're not going because they have a clear plan. I think they're going because they're driven by their love, by their grief, by all of the emotions that accompanied them from Friday sundown straight on through until the darkness of Sunday morning, just as darkness was turning to morning light. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes, Tom.
I appreciated Joseph's describing how big the tomb, the stone across the whole of the tomb was.
Yeah, and why would I mean, Joseph obviously didn't purchase that tomb and design it and all the rest with just in case the Messiah should need it. Clearly. But why in the world would Joseph have put such an enormous stone that would have taken a dozen workmen to have rolled back? And by the way, you can see these, there are a lot of stone tombs around in the Holy Land today. We drove by one in our bus, and there it was with a stone, and they were explaining to us that many of them were on a track that was angled back, so it could be rolled to cover easily. But you had gravity working against you to open that tomb. By the way, you had to open that tomb. 1 year after you put the body in, you had to go into the tomb. Why? Because after a year in that climate, flesh and all except for bones were gone. And that would be the time you would take the bones and they would be moved from where they had been laid for that year into a box, a bone box. And this was where the skeletal remains of a loved one would go into that box, the lid closed, and it would go onto a shelf in the family crypt. And it just took a year. So on that 1 year anniversary, which is actually kind of important in all sorts of ways, but it would be the day you would go back and you would then move the body into its final resting place, which was for the skeleton, not for the person who had just died. Yeah. So, for any of us who have watched The Chosen, we know, and for any of us who have watched biblical epics like I did as a kid and still, we know that it is the playwright's art or the screenwriter's art to sort of flesh out the stories. And I have actually been impressed with the work that the screenwriters of The Chosen, usually very responsibly, weaving together the stories. But we all do that. We all, in a sense, make sense of these stories, and we don't simply isolate. I don't know none of you has ever come up to me, Randy hasn't come up and said, I'm a gospel guy, so I'll be back next year. You know, that we do harmonize, we weave together the stories, and in fact, so do the four evangelists. I think when you read Luke's telling, he adds some information like Herod Antipas. What? Walk across my swimming pool. Where did that come from? Luke has special information. But generally speaking, from Mark and then to Matthew and then to Luke and then even to John, we have a commentary on the earlier traditions that flesh it out and deepen it more. And I think we still do the same. In our own devotional life, we come to church on Good Friday and we hear again the story, and we bathe that event with our tears, with our faith, with our hope, and await the coming of Sunday morning for ourselves as well. Thank you. Next week, one more, uno más, and we're not telling you. Thank you all very, very much. And, you know, and he doesn't want me to thank him, but thanks to Tom Spadero, who has been making video recordings of these sessions that are now available on our YouTube page, FLCS Live. If you have not yet gone onto that YouTube page and subscribed, please do. It will allow us to reach more and more people because the number of subscribers that can view is restricted somewhat by how many people have already subscribed. So, tell a friend. Or tell a pitched enemy. I don't care who you tell. Just get them to subscribe. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Another dramatic interpretation of Joseph's Arimathea. If you ever read The Silver Chalice, it was a movie back then. I don't think I read it.